In this video, we're going to look at graphing transformations of sines and cosine graphs. We're going to use something referred to as the rectangle method. So the first thing that we want to do is find the properties of the function. So we need to know minimally, maximum, minimum, period, and phase shift. So thinking back to when we found properties, remember we need to be in factored form before we do that. So we're going to make this y equals 2 cosine 1/2 x minus pi over 2 and then plus 1. From there, I'm going to pull my amplitude, which is 2, and my vertical shift, which is 1, and that will give me my maximum of 3 and my minimum of -1. From there, I'm going to try to find my period. So period, remember, is 2 pi divided by the 1/2. Remember that b value, so that's going to give me 4 pi. And my phase shift, which is going to be pi over 2. Now I want to set up my axes. So my max and min is what I want to see on my y-axis. So on my y-axis, I'm going to make sure I can find the number 3 and -1. So I'm just going to go 2 boxes is 1, 2, and 3. And then down 2 boxes, -1, -2. So just be consistent along that axis. Your x-axis doesn't have to match it in your units, but you need to be consistent along each axis. Then this phase shift and period is what I want to see on my x-axis. So my phase shift is pi over 2, so that's sort of the smallest unit I need to be able to identify. So I'm going to go 2 boxes and make that pi, because in this first box is pi over 2, so then I'll go 2 pi, 3 pi. I went out to 5 pi because you want to go a little bit past your period at least so that you can get through the end of the period if you have a shift to the right. Okay, so once I do that, I'm going to draw this rectangle. Don't feel like you have to do this. This is just sort of a procedure that you can use to help you. So if you can do this without it, that's fine. But it's just a strategy to use. So I'm going to make a rectangle and I'm going to draw a horizontal line at your maximum and minimum. So my maximum is at 3. My minimum is at -1. So remember, if those are my max and my mins, they're bounding my graph and I'm not going to go beyond those. I like to also draw a line at my vertical shift because that's actually my middle value, so this is my midline. Now I'm going to draw some vertical lines first at my phase shift. So I'm going to draw a vertical line at pi over 2. Then I want to draw a vertical line at my period plus my phase shift, so 4 pi plus pi over 2 would be 4.5 pi. Or if you prefer, you can kind of do it visually. Come here to the origin, and the first vertical line we drew was 1 box to the right of the origin. So come out to your period, which is 4 pi, and go 1 box to the right, which is at 4.5 pi, which is what we came up with when we added those two together. I'm going to mark these values on here just in case you want to come back and see. So this is our maximum, this is our minimum, this is the vertical shift, this is the phase shift, and this is the phase shift plus the period. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my function and I'm going to notice that this is a cosine function. So inside this rectangle here, I'm going to draw a cosine function or a cosine curve, one cycle of the cosine curve. So I have to remember that a cosine curve starts at the maximum and goes all the way down to the minimum and then back to the maximum. So on the right or on the left side of this rectangle, I'm going to draw a point at the maximum. And then I'm going to come down and I'm going to hit the middle value, and that would be 1/4 of the way through this rectangle here. So I'm going to hit my middle value here. So that's why I drew the midline in, so it's easy to identify that middle value. And then I'm going to come down and I'm going to hit the minimum. And then I have to go back up and I'm going to hit that middle value again. And then I should be at the end of the rectangle again because I'm hitting a maximum, because that cosine curve, remember, goes maximum to maximum. So I've got one cycle in here. Be careful, a lot of people tend to kind of do the parabola thing and go up from here because that's sort of what you're used to, but remember this is a periodic function, so it's actually coming down this way. So I've got this one cycle here, and then make sure you continue to like curve that back down. So if you need to, you can continue your pattern again if you need another cycle, going this way too, and then you've got your graph. All right, I want to look at one more example here. So remember, the first thing I want to do is identify, is this in factored form? X is not completely by itself, so first thing I'm going to do is factor. So y equals -3 sine. I'm going to factor out the pi over 2, and I'm going to be left with x plus 1 and then -2. I'm going to pull my properties out of here. So my amplitude is 3, Remember, I take the absolute value of that. My vertical shift is -2, which will give me a maximum of -2 plus 3, or 1, and a minimum of -5. My period will be 2 pi divided by pi over 2, which will give me 4. And then my phase shift is going to be -1. So again, at this point, I want to set up my axes. So I want to see 1 and -5 on my x-axis. So again, I'm going to go 2 boxes as 1 unit. And then along my x-axis, I want to see the -1 and the 4. So easily enough, I'm going to actually use the same scale here. So 2 boxes is 1 unit. Now I'm going to draw my rectangle. So I'm going to draw that line at the maximum and the minimum. I'm going to do the line at my vertical shift. Then I'm going to draw a line at my phase shift. So I'm going to draw the line here at -1. And then my phase shift plus my period is going to give me 4 minus 1 is 3. So I'm going to draw my line here. Again, if you prefer to do this a little more visually, come to your origin. We drew that first line 2 boxes to the left of the origin. So then come out to your period, which is 4, and go 2 boxes to the left, and that's where we drew our line. Now I'm going to come back to my function. I'm doing a sine curve, but also pay attention to the negative in front. It's actually reflected. So this is a reflected sine curve. So we got to remember a sine curve starts at the middle and usually goes up, but because it's reflected, it's going to start in the middle and then go down. So on the left side of this rectangle, I'm going to start at the midline, and then instead of going up for a typical sine curve, I'm going to go down to the minimum, and then I'm going to come back to that midline, up to the maximum, and then back to that midline. So kind of connecting those dots together. If I want to continue that, I can just do that pattern again. And I'm going to hit the maximum and then back to that middle. Remember, this is continuing on this side too.